Hello there guys. In this video I'm starting a new dual build project, the first part of which involves one of the biggest boxes in my stash, and certainly the biggest box I think I've seen from Airfix, which is this B-17G with bomber resupply set. As you can see, it's so big it doesn't even fit into the frame of my camera, and this features Airfix's 2016 tooling of its 1/72 scale B-17G, along with a fuel trailer, a tractor unit, a service truck and a bomb trailer. Perhaps surprisingly, I've only ever built one B-17 before, which was this Academy release of the B-17E Pacific Theatre, which I built a long time ago, way before I had my YouTube channel. And I'm not really sure why, but I remember not particularly enjoying the build. I don't know why, it wasn't a particularly difficult build, but I seem to remember not being particularly pleased with the result. So hopefully I'll do a better job this time. Now, I said this was a dual build. The first part is the B-17 with a resupply set. The second part is a B-17 as well, of sorts. When is a B-17 not a B-17? When it's a Fortress Mark III. So this is the B-17G in RAF use, with a few changes which I will describe during the course of this video. But the most obvious one there from the box cover is the lack of the chin turret and the radar dome there instead. The Fortress didn't see a lot of RAF use, with them receiving 20 Fortress 1s, which was the 17C, 19 Fortress 2s, which was the B-17F, 2 A's, which was the B-17E model, and then the Fortress 3, which was based on the B-17G, as we see here. The Fortress 1s and 2s were often used by Coastal Command for maritime patrol, but the Fortress 3 was almost exclusively used for electronic countermeasures. So that was basically jamming and disrupting German radar and so on in the support of RAF bombing raids. So of course, since these two boxings are extremely similar, I thought I would build them up alongside each other and just point out to you during the build process any differences between them. If we have a look at the instructions, we can see a couple of those differences now. And it's actually really nice to see that Airfix have gone to the trouble of changing even some of these small things between the US and the RAF versions. So for example, here in step 45, we have the nose of the US version, the B-17G, with the various equipment, including of course the famous Norden bomb sight. And over in the RAF version, just an ever so slightly different setup, no bomb sight, and a different piece of equipment there on the desk. The ball turret is one big difference. The B-17G has one, the RAF version doesn't, it simply blanks over that opening. I suppose a bit like they blanked over the top turret on the Dambusters version of the Lancaster. The RAF version though does still maintain the top turret as well as the rear turret and the waist guns. There are a few other differences as well, which I'll point out as I build the two models. So in terms of paint schemes, we've got this interesting scheme here, Thundermug. Now about halfway through the production of the B-17G, they moved from the overall olive drab with neutral grey on the underside to a natural metal finish. This scheme here seems to represent an aircraft which is in olive drab overall, but has clearly had some kind of replacement wing there, presumably from a later aircraft, which is why it's not painted. That's an interesting scheme certainly, but I'm not really a fan of the olive drab personally. So I actually bought some third-party decals to produce a natural metal finish overall scheme. And my decals give me two options. I've got the Ice Col Katy, which is not the same aircraft as Ice Cold Katy. And I've got Anxious Angel. Both very similar. They've got a little bit of nose art, and they've got very distinctive red flashes on the tail and the horizontal stabilizers, and on the wingtips too. For the RAF version, we've got two very similar schemes, with the standard camouflage scheme of dark earth and dark green on the top side, and black or night actually on the sides and the underside. And the only real difference between these two schemes is the code letters. Earlier fortresses were used in different schemes by the RAF, but I think the Gs were primarily used in this scheme. There were a couple that were used overseas, and I believe they had a single colour finish, I couldn't tell from the photos whether it was white or natural metal finish, but I thought I'd stick with the good old dark earth and dark green. Starting with the cockpit, I was really pleased with how these pieces went together. Very solid connection points, the slots and the tabs all working well to get the cockpit sides together. I did deviate slightly from the instructions though, so while I built up things like the seats, I left those separate for easier painting. The system that Airfix have used here is really effective, so the bulkhead goes at the back of the cockpit and keeps everything nice and square and sturdy, and then the bomb bay attaches to the rear of that. It looks a little bit wobbly here, but there's a roof section that goes on top of that and holds everything square again. Now, although a lot of the structure of this is required for the rigidity of the kit, initially I didn't want to build up too much detail in the RAF version because I figured I'd have the bomb bay doors closed because the bomb bay wasn't used. Then I realised that wasn't quite true. The RAF didn't use the bomb bay for bombs, so I can still keep the doors closed. But instead what they did is use it to house this huge cylinder here, which is called Jostle, and is basically an airborne jamming device, designed to disrupt radio waves. And in fact the reason the RAF chose the B-17 to do that rather than say a Lancaster is because this is quite a tall device, and of course the Lancaster bomb bay is long, but it isn't that tall. So the B-17 was much more useful for fitting that in. And that's something I really like about modelling. I never knew any of that until I started building these kits. Although the radio operator's compartment is barely visible, there's only a tiny small window on each side, Airfix did give us these shelves and the equipment, so I did add them. I was a bit lazy and I didn't sand off those ejector pin marks because you really won't see those. Here you can see that the floor of that radio operator's compartment attaches to the back of the bomb bay. Here are the two nose sections which I mentioned earlier, RAF version on the left and the US Air Force version on the right. You can see here how the cockpit and the interior slots into the fuselage side, and how a small amount of that fuselage interior will need painting because it will be visible. B-17 interior colour seems to be one of those questions which comes up all the time online. I've gone with the simplest answer, which was basically its natural metal finish, so aluminium on the inside, for everything except the cockpit. And the cockpit is in a US interior green, which is not the same as the RAF interior green, but is a bit darker and a bit more green. So with that in mind, I gave all of the interior a coat of Vallejo metal colour aluminium. I gave the floors a coat of wood and deck tan because they were made from plywood. And down the centre they had anti-slip rubber mats which I painted by hand in black. For the cockpit green I mixed my own using XF3 yellow and XF5 green at a ratio of 2 to 3. Or was it 3 to 2? I forget now. Anyway, this is what it came out like. And of course I did all the usual detail painting with Vallejo model colour, so black for the equipment, khaki for the canvas shrouds at the bottom of the control columns, and I wasn't really sure what colour to paint the seats, to be honest. I think they should be green, but really they should have some yellow US Air Corps cushions on them as well, which don't seem to be included in this kit. As I was building the engines, I was quite impressed by the amount of detail in the wheel wells. And of course on the B-17 we don't have any covers for those wheel wells, so they're visible whether the wheels are up or down. And again, from what I could understand, even the wheel wells were just natural metal finish. There was no zinc chromate primer or anything like that on them from the sources that I read. Here's a good example of a tiny difference that Airfix have picked up on between the two versions. This part here, L9, the box with the kind of curved top, is not present on the US version of the aircraft, it's only on the RAF version. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think that's quite nice that Airfix have remembered that and included it, it would be quite easy to miss, especially on the exhaust, on the underside where you're not really going to see it. In fact, that whole L sprue contains all of the differences there between the versions. I was quite surprised at the level of detail Airfix have included on the engines, especially when I realised that this is all going to be hidden. This is actually the back of the engine and will be completely covered by the engine cowl. In fact, when I first realised that, I thought I'd made a mistake and I'd somehow put this part in back to front, and it should be pointing forwards. But no, it does go backwards, and it is completely covered once it's there. With the interior of the engine cowls painted aluminium, the wing top and bottom could go together. The fit here was generally really good. I found it better to get the wings themselves stuck together and then come back for a second attempt, a second round of glue once the first lot was dry, to get the halves of the engine cowl perfectly aligned. And there are those engines that I mentioned before. I did have a bit of difficulty here. The two cowling pieces are supposed to go over the engine from the front, but they don't actually fit. It's just a bit too tight. So I had to put one of them on from the back and one from the front. So they needed to be attached to the engine before the engine could go onto the wing. But it's no big deal. I spotted it during dry fitting, so it's all good. I built up the landing gear but left them off because, of course, they're high targets for catching and braking. But the system itself is really strong. 2 parts make up the landing gear legs. And again, a subtle difference, we have these diamond patterned tyres for the US version, but for the RAF version we have the tyres with the concentric grooves. Again, a small difference, but a nice addition. The tail turret is an interesting construction. Of course, there's quite a few small pieces of glass in it, so what Airfix have done is moulded the whole thing in clear plastic, and that gives you the opportunity to mask off those windows and then just paint the rest of it. Of course, that means I'll need to either mask the inside and the outside, because the inside will need painting too, or just paint the outside since I'm doing a natural metal finish anyway. So the machine guns just build up there and then slot inside. The top turret is similarly very simple to build. This is a later version of the B-17G because it has these staggered waist gun positions. I'm not really sure what these 2 parts here, L11, are, but again, coming from the L sprue, they are dedicated to the RAF version of the aircraft. And you know what, it's just while I'm making the commentary for this video that I've realised those instructions don't show the armoured glass going in on the RAF version. That means I need to go back and take mine out because I added them by mistake. Another option that the instructions give us is this dorsal gun which goes in the radio operator's compartment. The instructions would have us put this in the US version but not in the RAF version. But in reality, even the US B-17s often got rid of this dorsal gun because it was the least effective of all the armaments on the aircraft. So with all that painting and preparation done, it was time to get everything together. The instrument panel with the large decal goes in place, and then the cockpit can go into the side of the fuselage with the bomb bay behind it. And what I typically did here was glue the cockpit into one side of the fuselage, but then press the other fuselage side in place to keep everything snug and fitting right, and tape it together while that one side glued. Then I did the same thing for the radio operator's room and floor, and for the nose section. Here's a final view of the interior before I close everything up. I like the fact that Airfix gave us a single piece bomb bay door, so we can have them closed like this, and if we want them open like I do on the US version, we have to cut those in two. That was quite a snug fit though into the RAF version. As you also might notice, there are still a few sprue nubs and so on the ends of my pieces here. I tend to leave those on until the fuselage halves are together and then cut them off together. Otherwise it's easy to take a bit more off one side than the other, and you end up with dips and dents and so on in your fuselage. There was a small amount of sanding to do on the seams of the fuselage and the wings, but very soon I was able to slide the wings into place, and we've got the 2 rails and the 3 tabs to hold them in the right position. And the final step was the cheek gun areas. These are supplied as separate clear parts, partly because the glazing is so small that it's easier to mask off if it's one large part, and partly because the configuration of this area changed quite a lot throughout the B-17's life, so I guess this makes it easier for Airfix to pop in and out parts. I painted those black on the inside, followed by the aluminium, and then of course they will get painted with the rest of the aircraft on the exterior. I masked off all of the glazing with Tamiya masking sheet, fitted the cockpit glass after giving it a coat of interior green, and then used tissue paper to block up the various openings for the turrets and the glazing and so on that I hadn't fitted yet. And with that, my B-17s were ready for painting and priming. So there we go guys, that was my build of the B-17G and the Fortress 3, both from Airfix. I think for my future videos on this I'm going to split them in 2, so I'll do one video on the RAF version, finishing it, painting it, etc., and then another video for the US version, and either in that video or in a separate video of course, I will also build that US resupply set. I was really pleasantly surprised by this kit. Airfix have done a great job on it, as they often do, but it was still nice to see everything fitting well, and it was good to see that there was none of the warping of the pieces, which I did get with basically every Lancaster that I've built from Airfix. The bomb bay doors in particular, but also the fuselage halves in the Lancasters are quite notorious for warping, but there were no issues whatsoever with this. Everything was nice and straight and square, as it should be. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and special thanks to my Patreon members and YouTube supporters. I do hope I'll see you in a future video, and until then, thank you again for watching, and have fun modelling.